They called themselves God's chosen rulers, the Habsburgs, a dynasty that stretched across Europe from the Alps to the Spanish throne. For centuries, they wore crowns of gold, commanded armies, and married only those who shared their royal blood. But that obsession, to stay pure, untouchable, divine, became their curse. In candlelit palaces, deals were struck between cousins. Brides wept as they married their own uncles. Generations of inbreeding slowly twisted their bloodline, leaving behind a legacy of deformities, madness, and death. The famous Habsburg jaw became a grotesque symbol of their pride, the price they paid for power. By the time their empire began to crumble, their bodies told the story their history books tried to hide. Faces warped by genetics, minds broken by lineage, a dynasty slowly destroying itself from within. This is the story the royal portraits want to show you. The dark genetic secrets and twisted marriages that turned Europe's most powerful family into a living warning. If you love history's darkest truths and hidden stories, subscribe and stay until the end. Because what you're about to hear isn't just disturbing, it's unforgettable. Long before the deformities, the Habsburgs were symbols of divine favor. Their story began in the rugged heart of medieval Europe, a dynasty born among the mountains of modern-day Switzerland and Austria. What started as a family of minor counts in the 11th century became a force that reshaped the continent. By the late Middle Ages, they ruled not by conquest, but by marriage, a strategy so effective it was whispered as prophecy. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Through careful unions, they gained kingdoms without shedding blood. When most empires relied on armies, the Habsburgs relied on weddings. A daughter's hand meant a new territory. A son's betrothal meant a crown. With each marriage, their reach grew: Bohemia, Hungary, Burgundy, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire. Their power spread like ivy, creeping silently across Europe's royal courts. But beneath that brilliance, something dangerous began to form. The idea that their blood itself, their lineage, was sacred. This belief became doctrine. To mix with outsiders was to taint the divine order they believed God had granted them. What started as political convenience evolved into obsession. They would not risk losing power to strangers, even if it meant turning inward toward their own kin. By the 15th century, their alliances began to twist. Royal cousins became lovers, uncles wed nieces, and entire branches of the family folded back upon themselves. The Habsburg family tree no longer grew outward. It curled in like a vine, strangling its own stem. Courtiers celebrated these unions as symbols of purity, but physicians and priests began whispering warnings. Children were being born frail, sickly, or with faces eerily alike, traits that became unmistakably Habsburg. Still, the dynasty's success blinded them. Maximilian I, one of their most ambitious rulers, saw marriage as destiny. He secured his son's union with the heiress of Spain, uniting two vast empires. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, and a genetic gamble that would echo for centuries. Their descendants would inherit not just thrones, but flaws buried deep within their blood. As the family's power expanded, so did their sense of isolation. Surrounded by enemies, they convinced themselves that only their own kind could be trusted. Paranoia disguised itself as piety. What they saw as divine protection was, in truth, self-destruction. The very blood that had built their empire would one day bring it to ruin. The Habsburgs had risen to rule half of Europe without a single great war. But their greatest victory carried the seed of their downfall, a genetic trap hidden in every royal wedding portrait, waiting for the moment when their proud lineage would turn against them. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Habsburgs had perfected the art of marriage as conquest. Their treaties were written not in ink, but in vows whispered before altars. Each ceremony was a political chess move disguised as devotion. When Maximilian I arranged the union of his son Philip with Joanna of Castile. It was more than romance. It was the quiet annexation of Spain's future. The wedding united two empires separated by mountains and language, and for a brief moment, Europe seemed to orbit around a single bloodline. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its simplicity. While rival houses emptied their treasuries on battlefields, the Habsburgs used bridal processions as their armies. Dowries replaced cannons, heirs replaced treaties. A royal birth could redraw the map faster than a victory at war. Every cradle carried a crown, every christening sealed a new alliance. Yet behind the triumphal music and golden processions, anxiety simmered. A network of marriages meant a web of competing loyalties. Spanish nobles feared Austrian influence. German princes whispered that Vienna's ambitions stretched too far. To keep control, the Habsburg patriarchs tightened their grip, insisting that only direct blood could be trusted to rule their vast, scattered realms. Outsiders were useful, but never equals. This thinking bred secrecy and suspicion. Royal ambassadors were tasked with finding partners not for love, but for geography. A duchess whose lands bordered France, a princess whose father commanded a navy, a cousin who could inherit a vulnerable province. Marriage became logistics. Women were bargaining chips. Men were pawns in dynastic equations. But the calculations were coldly effective. By the time Charles V inherited the throne, the family's reach was unprecedented. He ruled territories where the sun literally never set, from the Spanish colonies in the Americas to the heart of Central Europe. To his subjects, he was proof that divine favor guided the Habsburg line. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of imperial arrogance. But even as his empire expanded, cracks began to form beneath its marble surface. Maintaining unity across so many cultures required absolute obedience. Every branch of the family had to serve the dynasty's plan, and that meant more intermarriage, more isolation. Each generation drew closer together, binding themselves into a circle that no outsider could penetrate. The policy that once brought them power was becoming a prison. In portraits from this period, the Habsburgs appear serene, embroidered robes, jeweled crosses, serene gazes fixed toward heaven. Yet behind those serene expressions were people haunted by duty, aware that their marriages were less about affection and more about survival. The empire they built through the altar was magnificent, but it demanded an impossible price. A lineage so tightly bound that one day it would begin to collapse under its own perfection. The Habsburgs had conquered without bloodshed, but the true cost of peace was hidden deep within their own. As the 16th century unfolded, the Habsburgs' power stood unmatched. Their banners flew from the Pyrenees to the Carpathians, and their crests adorned cathedrals across Europe. Yet behind that splendor, a belief had taken root so deep it would define every decision they made. Their blood was not merely noble, it was sacred. In their eyes, the dynasty was a vessel chosen by God. This conviction, once a symbol of unity, hardened into an article of faith. Priests blessed each new union, declaring that divine order itself rested upon the continuation of the Habsburg line. To intermarry with common royalty became unthinkable. To bring an outsider into the family was to challenge heaven's will. Their obsession with purity blurred the line between religion and rule. Inside their marble palaces, arranged marriages turned into rituals of preservation. Dowries became secondary. Lineage became law. Each proposal was studied through the lens of ancestry, not affection. Genealogists were summoned to trace bloodlines like priests interpreting scripture. A single flaw in lineage could end a union before it began. The family's advisors boasted that no other house could rival the holiness of Habsburg heritage, and no one dared contradict them. But obsession carries a quiet rot. With every generation, the pool of eligible relatives grew smaller. Cousins were matched with cousins because no one else was pure enough. The intimacy of family life twisted into strategy. Letters between courts discussed children not as sons or daughters, but as future instruments of policy. Even childhood friendships were shaped by expectation. Every smile, every gesture, every lesson prepared them to marry someone who shared their surname. The results were rarely kind. Chronic illness, frail bodies, and strikingly similar features became impossible to ignore. Doctors murmured that the dynasty's ailments were hereditary. Priests called them divine tests. Portraits from this era revealed faces molded by generations of selective unions, long jaws, narrow eyes, and solemn expressions that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Yet the Habsburgs refused to see weakness. They interpreted these traits as signs of distinction, proof that they were different, elevated, chosen. To them, resemblance was not deformity, it was destiny. The court painters immortalized that conviction, producing images where every chin and cheekbone looked almost identical, as though the bloodline itself had a face. Behind the ritual of purity, fear thrived. They had built a world so insulated that stepping outside, it felt like betrayal. Foreign suitors were viewed as threats, their blood suspect, their intentions impure. Every marriage that stayed within the circle seemed to confirm their righteousness, even as it deepened the cracks forming beneath. In chasing perfection, the Habsburgs began to seal their fate. The divine blessing they guarded so fiercely was slowly transforming into a curse, one that no crown, no empire, no devotion could undo. When Charles II of Spain breathed his final, labored breath in 1700, his death did not bring peace. It unleashed chaos. The great European powers had long anticipated the moment, circling his fragile empire like vultures. With no direct heir and a fortune of territories at stake, the question was simple yet perilous. Who would inherit the dying monarch's crown? The Habsburg dominion stretched across oceans, encompassing lands too vast for one ruler to govern. Its inheritance promised unimaginable influence and threatened to unbalance the continent. Behind closed doors, diplomats traded promises, monarchs sharpened ambitions, and armies prepared for a conflict disguised as succession. France moved first. Louis XIV, the Sun King, claimed the Spanish throne for his grandson, Philip of Anjou. The Austrian Habsburgs countered, asserting their right through another bloodline. What followed was not a mere dispute. It was a continental reckoning. From the plains of Flanders to the hills of Italy, soldiers clashed under banners representing not ideals, but dynastic claims. Cities burned, alliances shifted, and families mourned sons sacrificed to preserve royal entitlement. The War of the Spanish Succession transformed Europe into a chessboard of devastation, where each move was measured in blood and gold. While the fighting raged, propaganda became its own weapon. Pamphlets painted opposing rulers as tyrants, divine judgment as justification. Ordinary people starved and froze, caught in battles fought over a king they had never seen. For them, the so-called right to rule meant nothing. Survival was all that mattered. Years dragged on. Fortunes changed hands. Generals grew old while politicians rewrote treaties that dissolved as quickly as they were signed. The war's purpose, to preserve balance, instead shattered it. The map of Europe redrew itself, its scars still visible in the nations that emerged from the wreckage. When the peace treaties were finally signed in 1713, exhaustion had replaced victory. The Habsburgs lost Spain but retained Austria and their claim to the Holy Roman Empire. France gained influence but bled itself financially. The dream of a united Habsburg world crumbled, leaving behind fragmented kingdoms and fractured pride. What endured was not triumph, but legacy, a cautionary echo of how pursued without restraint corrodes its foundation. The Habsburgs still held their thrones, but the divine aura had dimmed. The name once synonymous with destiny now carried the weight of ruin. In the end, Europe had not been conquered by a single empire, but consumed by its own ambitions. The war had proven that bloodlines, however royal, are mortal threads and when stretched too far, they tear. As the smoke cleared over Europe's battlefields, one truth became inescapable. Dynasties may believe they rule by heaven's decree, but history always collects its debt in flesh and time. By the dawn of the 19th century, the grandeur that had once surrounded the Habsburg name began to erode like old plaster beneath gilded paint. The empire still sprawled across Central Europe, its borders stitched together by history rather than harmony. Vienna remained magnificent, chandeliers still glimmered, orchestras still filled marble halls, but beneath the glitter, exhaustion hung in the air. The world had changed. Revolutions erupted across Europe, demanding liberty instead of loyalty. The divine right of kings, once unquestioned, was now met with whispers of rebellion. In cities like Paris and Budapest, monarchs were no longer sacred figures. They were symbols of what must end. And yet, within the vast echoing palaces of the Habsburgs, tradition clung on with brittle fingers. Emperor Franz II, proud yet weary, watched his realm transform faster than he could command it. The French Revolution had already executed one monarch, and Napoleon's rise threatened to erase centuries of royal order. When the Holy Roman Empire, the ancient title of Habsburg glory, finally dissolved in 1806, it was not torn down by an enemy's sword, but by inevitability itself. The empire had grown too large, too fragile, too bound to an idea the world no longer believed in. Still, the family refused to fade. They rebranded themselves as Emperors of Austria, clinging to ceremony as though it could rewrite destiny. Portraits of long-dead ancestors stared down from palace walls, reminders of when their bloodline commanded continents. Every banquet, every coronation, every meticulously arranged marriage was a ritual of denial, a performance meant to convince the world, and perhaps themselves, that their divine inheritance remained intact. Yet outside those palace gates, the ground trembled with change. Railways carved through fields once ruled by noble estates. Factories blackened the skies. Merchants and soldiers, not kings, began shaping history. While Vienna's court waltzed to Strauss, Europe marched toward modernity. Within the Habsburg family, fractures deepened. Generations raised to rule found themselves trapped between nostalgia and necessity. Some sought reform, others clung to the past. Conversations that once echoed with strategy now carried undertones of anxiety. Could a dynasty built on sacred blood survive a world that no longer believed in sacred anything? Franz Joseph, who would one day reign for nearly 70 years, was born into this tension, a prince destined to rule a fading world. His youth was surrounded by grandeur, yet overshadowed by unease. The empire's strength was an illusion. Its unity, a balancing act of languages, cultures, and rivalries stitched together by tradition and fear. Even the architecture betrayed the truth. The palaces gleamed, but their foundations creaked. The marble floors, polished by servants for centuries, bore the weight of decline. The empire was no longer expanding. It was preserving itself, embalmed in ritual, sustained by memory. For the Habsburgs, history was both armor and chain. Their ancestors' achievements granted them legitimacy, yet those same ghosts haunted every decision. They ruled not as visionaries, but as caretakers of a relic too sacred to alter. And though they refused to admit it, the age of empires had begun to rot from within. The Habsburgs would still reign, still command, still smile from balcony windows, but the shimmer of divine destiny had dulled into something fragile and mortal. Beneath the velvet and ceremony, the empire's heart had already begun to stop beating. When Franz Joseph ascended the throne in 1848, the empire was trembling. Europe burned with revolution. Barricades rose in the streets, and monarchs fled from the fury of their own subjects. For the young emperor, barely 18, the crown was no triumph. It was a chain of gold, heavy with expectation, forged by ancestors whose portraits watched from every corridor. He inherited not just territories but disillusionment. The Habsburg realm, vast yet fractured, was a mosaic of nations held together by habit more than loyalty. Hungarians demanded autonomy, Italians sought independence, and the empire's many tongues murmured different dreams of freedom. Franz Joseph's task was to hold them all, to keep order in a world dissolving before his eyes. Discipline became his faith. He believed in uniformity, in the sanctity of obedience. Where others might have adapted, he enforced. To him, change was betrayal. The empire would endure only through control, and control required sacrifice, of mercy, of sentiment, of the self. Each decree he signed tightened the structure of his domain, but loosened the bond with his people. His reign became a paradox, outwardly serene, inwardly burdened. He was a man encased in ritual, surrounded by advisors who echoed tradition but feared innovation. Behind the palace gates, order appeared eternal, yet beyond them, history accelerated. Steamships crossed oceans, telegraphs bridged distances, and ideologies spread faster than armies could march. The emperor's world was shrinking, even as his map still sprawled across continents. The pressures of rule carved themselves into his soul. Personal tragedies followed. His brother executed in Mexico, his only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, found lifeless beside his mistress at Mayerling. Each loss stripped away another layer of imperial illusion. The man who once embodied stability became a relic of endurance, outlasting those he loved while presiding over a system he could no longer repair. Vienna's court, once the heartbeat of Europe, turned somber. The laughter of aristocrats faded into formality. Even celebrations carried a sense of mourning, a quiet acknowledgement that the empire existed more as memory than reality. Yet Franz Joseph persisted, bound by duty, incapable of surrender. He rose at dawn each day, performed the same routines, signed papers by the hundreds. To him, repetition was not futility, it was resistance. Each signature, each inspection, each bowed head was proof that his world had not yet collapsed. But the truth, whispered through the marble halls, was unavoidable. The empire survived only because he did. As decades passed, the emperor aged into myth. His image, stoic, unreadable, eternal, adorned coins and portraits. Yet behind those steady eyes lay exhaustion deeper than any battlefield wound. He had outlived revolutions, wars, and his own heirs, but not the slow erosion of relevance. By the turn of the 20th century, Franz Joseph stood as the final thread binding a disjointed world. His endurance inspired reverence, but his rigidity ensured decay. He was not merely the ruler of Austria-Hungary. He was its reflection, majestic, weary, and trapped in the twilight between glory and extinction. By the summer of 1914, the empire resembled an aging monument, magnificent from afar, but cracked beneath its surface. The air itself felt brittle with uncertainty. In Vienna's cafes, conversation shifted uneasily between art and politics, as though beauty could disguise the scent of something approaching. No one could name it, but everyone sensed that the balance holding their world together was slipping. Far from the imperial palaces, in the restless city of Sarajevo, discontent smoldered. Nationalists whispered of liberation, conspirators spoke of vengeance, and secret societies plotted in candlelit rooms. The empire's boundaries contained too many peoples, too many grievances. Each province nursed its own resentment, each border its own ghosts. And among them moved Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to a realm already dying. He was not his uncle's mirror. Franz Ferdinand sought reform, not rigidity. He dreamed of reshaping the empire into a federation, a fragile hope of unity through compromise. But his ideas threatened both conservatives and revolutionaries alike. To one side, he was a danger to privilege. To the other, a symbol of oppression. His presence in Sarajevo on June 28th was intended as reassurance, yet it became the spark that ignited the century. The morning sun glared off cobblestones as the motorcade wound along the riverbank. Crowds gathered, some curious, others seething. When the first assassination attempt failed, a bomb bouncing off the Archduke's car, it seemed fate had intervened. But fate, that day, had patience. Hours later, a wrong turn brought the Archduke face to face with a young gunman, Gavrilo Princip. 2 shots rang out. In seconds, the future of Europe bled out onto the street. The empire reacted with disbelief and fury. Newspapers called for vengeance. Generals drew maps, and diplomats convinced themselves that swift punishment would restore order. Instead, it shattered it. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Alliances snapped into place like gears in a vast, grinding machine. By August, the world was at war. As soldiers marched beneath banners proclaiming loyalty to emperor and fatherland, few grasped the scale of what was beginning. Trains carried them east and west, toward fronts that would devour millions. The old empire, built on tradition and hierarchy, entered a conflict born of industry and nationalism, forces it could neither understand nor contain. In the trenches, mud replaced marble. The grandeur of Vienna meant little to men freezing on the Carpathian slopes or drowning in Galician swamps. Orders came from distant offices, indifferent to the lives they spent. The emperor's portrait hung in every barracks, a reminder of duty to a world that no longer existed. Back in the capital, ration lines grew longer. Funerals multiplied until mourning became routine. The music of Strauss fell silent. The waltz of empire ended in the rhythm of marching boots. Letters from the front spoke of exhaustion, of hunger, of disbelief that the fighting could still go on. By 1916, the strain had hollowed the monarchy. Franz Joseph, ancient and frail, watched from his study as reports arrived like death notices for his creation. He had survived revolutions, assassinations, and endless discontent, yet now faced an enemy he could not outlast. Time. When he died that November, the empire mourned him as a father, even as it began to dissolve with him. In Sarajevo, the blood that had stained the pavement 12 years earlier seemed prophetic. What began as a single act of defiance became the requiem for a dynasty. The Habsburg name, once invoked with awe, now lingered like an echo fading through the ruins of Europe. Their legacy, once measured in kingdoms and crowns, was reduced to gravestones and fading portraits, reminders that even the grandest empires end not with conquest, but collapse. When Franz Joseph's coffin was lowered into the crypt beneath Vienna, a silence fell heavier than mourning. The man who had ruled for nearly 7 decades was gone, and with him vanished the illusion of permanence. The empire, once stitched together by ritual and discipline, was unraveling. Yet in the void he left behind, a new monarch rose, young, uncertain, and painfully human. His name was Karl. Karl I never sought the throne. It was thrust upon him by circumstance and catastrophe. Barely in his late 20s, he inherited a realm, drowning in war, debt, and despair. Where his predecessor had embodied endurance, Karl clung to faith, believing that decency could mend what centuries of ambition had broken. His face lacked the hardness of emperors past. His eyes held the earnestness of a man who still hoped reason could prevail over ruin. He visited the front lines, shook the hands of soldiers caked in mud, and spoke of peace. But his sincerity collided with machinery far greater than him. Generals dismissed him as naive. Allies doubted his resolve. Enemies saw weakness where there was mercy. In smoky conference halls, decisions were made that no act of kindness could reverse. The empire's fractures deepened until even loyalty began to splinter. Vienna itself grew unrecognizable. Once the glittering heart of Europe, it now pulsed with anxiety. Bread vanished from markets. Families sold heirlooms for food. The proud city of music and intellect transformed into a place of echoes, of empty ballrooms, of carriages replaced by wagons, of whispers about an ending too enormous to face. Posters still declared devotion to the emperor, but devotion could not fill an empty stomach. Karl sought secret peace talks, reaching out to foreign powers through coded letters and intermediaries. He dreamed of ending the conflict before it devoured what remained. But by the time his pleas reached the tables of negotiation, the empire's voice no longer mattered. Nationalism had outgrown dynastic diplomacy. The same marriage alliances that once united Europe were now meaningless against the surge of self-determination. The peoples of the empire, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Hungarians, Poles, began to envision nations of their own. In October 1918, the inevitable happened. Provinces declared independence one by one, like branches breaking from a dying tree. Flags changed overnight. Armies deserted. By November, Karl no longer ruled an empire, but a memory. When he abdicated, there was no ceremony, only exhaustion. The monarchy that had ruled for nearly 7 centuries ended not with revolution, but with resignation. He fled with his wife, Zita, and their children into exile, first to Switzerland, later to Madeira. The world he had inherited was gone. The palaces, the ministers, the courtiers, all remnants of a vanished order. In the damp isolation of his final days, Karl's letters revealed a heart still clinging to purpose. He spoke of forgiveness, of unity, of faith, words that history would soon forget, drowned out by louder ambitions. When he died in 1922, pneumonia claimed him swiftly. His funeral was small, stripped of grandeur. No empire saluted, no anthems played. Only the Atlantic wind carried the requiem of a dynasty that once believed itself eternal. In the ruins they left behind, modern Europe began to take shape. New nations rose from the fragments, each born of the same bloodlines that had once sworn allegiance to Vienna. The Habsburgs themselves became specters, figures of fascination, their portraits fading on museum walls, their palaces echoing with the ghosts of ceremony. The family that had ruled through marriage, through faith, through sheer endurance had finally met the one power it could not master: change. In the end, Karl was not the last emperor by accident. He was the quiet punctuation at the end of a 700-year sentence, the final breath of a world that mistook lineage for immortality. When the empire collapsed, its ruins were physical: fallen borders, lost crowns, shattered symbols. But buried deeper was an invisible legacy, etched not in stone, but in DNA. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed their blood carried divine authority. In truth, it carried something else: a slow, silent corrosion. Modern science would later trace what no court physician dared to name. Generations of intermarriage, intended to preserve power, had instead concentrated rare genetic traits until they became deformities. The Habsburg jaw, once whispered about in portraits, was not legend. It was mandibular prognathism, a condition that thrust the lower jaw forward, distorting speech and chewing, reshaping faces until they seemed carved from bone itself. Paintings from the royal galleries tell the story more clearly than any chronicle. Look closely at Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's most tragic heir. His chin juts sharply, his lips strained to close, his eyes seem lost in fatigue. He could barely eat without pain, spoke with difficulty, and suffered from seizures and infertility. Yet he was the product of generations, convinced that purity equaled perfection. His ancestry was so entangled that he had fewer distinct ancestors than a common farmer. The bloodline had folded upon itself so many times that nature finally rebelled. Geneticists studying the Habsburgs centuries later would confirm what their contemporaries only feared. The royal lineage displayed an unusually high degree of homozygosity, meaning identical genetic material, inherited from both parents. What was once a political strategy became a biological trap. Each cousin marriage narrowed the family's gene pool until defects that might have vanished in a wider population instead became destiny. The consequences reached beyond appearance. Fragile health, Mental instability and infertility haunted the dynasty's later generations. Charles II's autopsy revealed a body ravaged by inbreeding, a heart the size of a bean, lungs corroded, intestines filled with fluid. He died childless at 38, and with him ended the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. Contemporaries called him the Bewitched, believing witchcraft had cursed him. In reality, his suffering was hereditary, the sum of decisions made over centuries in candlelit chambers. Each alliance that once expanded the empire's reach had carried invisible consequences. Power had preserved their crowns, but at the cost of their own vitality. Even as the Austrian line continued, the physical traces remained unmistakable. Medical portraits of archdukes and duchesses revealed recurring features: elongated faces, drooping lips, broad jaws, shallow eyes. Artists softened the deformities with light and clothing, but no brush could disguise inheritance. Behind the grandeur of oil and velvet, the same pattern repeated, a dynasty's reflection warped by its own ambition. By the 20th century, when biology began to reveal the mechanisms of heredity, the full scale of the damage became clear. Scientists examined burial remains, cross-referenced genealogies, and calculated coefficients of inbreeding. The numbers confirmed what history had foreshadowed. The Habsburgs were victims of their own myth. Their attempt to keep royal blood pure had destroyed its strength. What made their story haunting wasn't simply mutation. It was intent. They had chosen it, generation after generation, believing themselves exempt from the laws that governed ordinary life. For them, divinity justified defiance of nature. And nature, patient and merciless, answered in kind. The same families who once ruled half of Europe had been undone not by rebellion or invasion, but by the very purity they worshipped. Their empire's fall began long before the guns of Sarajevo. It started in the wounds of queens and the choices of kings. The curse of the Habsburgs was never supernatural. It was genetic, the slow revenge of biology on human arrogance. As centuries passed, whispers about the Habsburg bloodline took on a life of their own. Courtiers spoke less of their victories and more of their afflictions. What had once been a symbol of divine selection began to look disturbingly like divine punishment. Faces once admired for their pale, noble features grew exaggerated and strange, jaws too long, lips too heavy, eyes set deep as if weighed down by unseen burdens. Physicians called it heredity. Priests called it a curse. In an age when medicine and superstition blurred, every illness in the royal family became an omen. A child born weak was proof that God's patience had waned. A king's madness could be traced to the sins of his ancestors. The Habsburgs, believing themselves chosen, could not accept that nature itself might rebel against their design. Instead, they searched for meaning in prophecy and myth. Their infirmities became woven into the tapestry of fate, signs that heaven tested those it had once favored. The infamous Habsburg jaw became both a symbol and a sentence. It marked generations like a seal upon wax, deepening with each consanguineous marriage. Beneath the royal portraits, the deformity was quietly documented: misaligned teeth, speech impediments, and difficulties in eating and breathing. Yet within the grand courts of Europe, painters softened those features, turning disfigurement into majesty. The illusion of perfection had to endure, even as the body faltered under the strain of its own lineage. Behind the glittering palaces, suffering became a private ritual. Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's most tragic heir, was born frail and deformed, unable to walk or speak properly for years. His body was a gallery of inherited failures: epilepsy, infertility, and premature aging. Yet to his subjects, he was not merely sick. He was cursed. Stories spread that witches had hexed him, that demons whispered through his fevers, that the shadows of his ancestors lingered in his chambers. When his health declined further, exorcists were summoned to drive out spirits rather than doctors to diagnose them. These tales reveal how the Habsburgs' decline blurred the line between biology and belief. Inbreeding had sculpted their features and undermined their vitality, but it was superstition that gave their suffering narrative power. To the faithful, it was retribution for their arrogance, the Almighty reclaiming what they had claimed for themselves. To skeptics, it was a warning about hubris disguised as heritage. By the time their dynasty began to fade, the Habsburgs had become living relics of their own myth, rulers haunted not by ghosts, but by their genes. Their portraits still hang in Europe's museums, silent witnesses to a lineage that mistook purity for permanence. Behind every gilded frame lies the quiet question that history never stopped asking. Were they undone by nature, or by the gods they believed had blessed them? The Habsburgs' lineage, once guarded as sacred, slowly became a labyrinth of fragile heirs and vanished futures. Each generation carried the weight of an empire balanced on brittle blood. What had begun as a quest for divine continuity turned into a pattern of loss that no prophecy could explain. Behind the grandeur of their courts, anxiety grew. Every cradle, every sickbed, every quiet funeral threatened the very survival of a dynasty that had chained itself to its own ancestry. Infant mortality haunted the royal nurseries. Children born to carefully arranged unions arrived weak, pale, or deformed, often surviving only long enough for their names to be recorded before the bells tolled again. Midwives whispered that the family was paying for its defiance of natural order, while priests urged more devotion, more prayers, more penance. The cycle repeated, each burial deepening the silence within marble halls once filled with celebration. Even those who lived to inherit crowns rarely escaped tragedy. Don Carlos of Spain, grandson of Emperor Charles V, embodied the dynasty's growing instability. He was violent, unpredictable, and consumed by paranoia, a young prince whose mind fractured under both illness and isolation. His imprisonment and mysterious death were declared an act of mercy, a desperate attempt to preserve dignity rather than expose decay. Official records spoke of melancholy, but courtiers knew the truth was far darker. Generations later, Archduke Rudolf, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, met his end at Mayerling in 1889. The scandal was carefully veiled in protocol, a supposed suicide pact with his mistress, Baroness Mary Witzera. Yet whispers in Vienna claimed political blackmail, family interference, or a hereditary madness that shadowed the dynasty. Whatever the cause, Rudolf's death left a chasm no alliance could fill. The empire's future dissolved in a hunting lodge bedroom, surrounded by secrets the court refused to name. Throughout these centuries, patterns emerged: sterility, frailty, and sudden death woven through coronations and weddings alike. Physicians drafted reports that mixed medicine with cautionary poetry, describing the Habsburg constitution as delicate as spun glass. Meanwhile, chroniclers turned tragedy into legend. Heirs cursed by ambition, queens haunted by visions, and kings undone by their own blood. Each story reinforced the unspoken belief that the family's misfortunes were not random, but inevitable. By the dawn of the 20th century, the dynasty had produced more ghosts than rulers. Their obsession with preserving lineage had ensured its extinction. The portraits that once signified triumph now seemed like memorials to genetic exhaustion. A dynasty undone not by rebellion or invasion, but by the slow collapse of its own design. In the end, the Habsburgs' greatest fear came true. Their bloodline survived only in history books, whispered as both a warning and a mystery that no empire could ever outlive. When the empire's power began to fade, the silence of the Habsburg palaces grew heavier. The marble corridors, once alive with royal processions, turned into echo chambers of the past. Servants spoke in hushed tones about presences that refused to leave shadows that lingered even after the last monarch had died. In these gilded halls, history didn't sleep. It whispered. At Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Guards told stories of a woman in white gliding through the imperial apartments before a death in the family. She was said to be a mourning spirit, her face veiled, her steps soundless. Generations of emperors claimed to have seen her. Some dismissed her as superstition. Others locked their doors when her name was mentioned. The Habsburgs, so proud of their lineage, began to wonder if their ancestors watched over them or warned them. Far from Vienna, in the Schönbrunn Palace gardens, night watchmen described hearing faint strains of music drifting from the ballroom long after midnight. When they entered, chandeliers trembled as if touched by invisible dancers. Some swore the figures were members of the long-dead court, replaying their final waltz in endless repetition, unaware that centuries had passed. For a family obsessed with legacy, these hauntings felt like echoes of their own unbroken circle, an eternity of remembrance they could neither escape nor silence. In Spain's El Escorial, where generations of Habsburg monarchs were entombed, monks spoke of flickering candles that refused to stay lit when certain names were spoken aloud. The air there seemed charged, as though centuries of prayer and regret had settled into the stones. Charles V himself was said to appear in the monastery's corridors, restless and cloaked, as if still weighing the sins of his empire. For the living, it was impossible to tell where legend ended and guilt began. But the most chilling tales came from lesser-known estates, remote castles abandoned after tragedy. In Bohemia, the ruins of Konopistic Castle were said to echo with a child's laughter, believed to belong to one of the countless Habsburg infants who died before reaching adulthood. Travelers who passed the site claimed to hear lullabies carried on the wind, voices fading whenever they tried to follow. Locals called it the cradle's curse, a reminder of the lives that ambition had stolen. Each haunting became a fragment of collective conscience, a story the dynasty couldn't control. The ghosts didn't represent rebellion or vengeance. They were the embodiment of remembrance. They kept alive what the Habsburgs tried to bury, a legacy shaped not just by power, but by consequence. By the turn of the century, their palaces had become museums, and their phantoms, curiosities. Yet to those who listen closely, the empire still breathes in the quiet between footsteps, in the rustle of old portraits, and in the chill that lingers wherever Habsburg marble meets moonlight. By the dawn of the 18th century, the grandeur of the Habsburg dynasty began to wither under the same force that had built it, its obsession with bloodline purity. Centuries of carefully arranged unions, meant to secure the empire's stability, had instead sown the seeds of its demise. Behind the gilded portraits and ornate coats of arms lay a truth that no royal decree could disguise. Their lineage was collapsing from within. The warning signs had been there for generations. Jawlines grew sharper, skulls elongated, and features became eerily uniform across distant cousins. Beneath the surface, the damage ran deeper. Infertility, miscarriages, and illnesses that defied the medical understanding of the time. Physicians noted strange patterns among the royal births. Children who couldn't thrive, heirs who wasted away before adulthood. Each diagnosis was cloaked in polite language, but everyone at court understood the unspoken reality. The family tree had turned sterile. The most tragic symbol of this decline was Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. His face bore the unmistakable mark of his ancestors: the protruding lower jaw, the sunken cheeks, the haunted eyes. Yet his physical deformities were only part of the tragedy. He suffered from seizures, digestive ailments, and mental instability. He could neither rule effectively nor produce an heir. Decades of isolation had left him surrounded by advisors more loyal to their own ambitions than to their fading monarch. When he died in 1700, childless and frail, an entire branch of the Habsburg dynasty ended with him. His death ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that consumed Europe for years. The struggle was not only over who would inherit his crown, but also over how far the empire's influence would reach without legitimate blood to sustain it. The dynasty's greatest weapon, its web of marriages, had become its undoing. Alliances that once guaranteed peace now triggered chaos. In Austria, the family tried to recover. The empire endured for another 2 centuries under the Austrian line, but even there, the signs of decline were clear. The population of eligible Habsburg heirs shrank, forcing marriages into increasingly narrow circles. New portraits revealed faces with familiar distortions, reminders of choices made long ago in candlelit chapels and diplomatic chambers. Every wedding carried the faint echo of a funeral. By the time the Austro-Hungarian Empire stumbled into the 20th century, its rulers were the ghosts of a genetic past. The once mighty bloodline had lost its vigor, its mystique replaced by fragility. The extinction of entire branches was not caused by war or revolt, but by a quiet, invisible inheritance, a flaw passed from cradle to crown. The Habsburgs had conquered Europe with diplomacy and faith, but in the end, neither could save them from themselves. Their story closed as it began, bound by the belief that power was born in the blood and destroyed by the same conviction. The death of Charles II did more than end a dynasty. It fractured the balance of Europe. With the Spanish throne vacant and no direct heir, centuries of careful diplomacy unraveled overnight. What had once been the Habsburgs' greatest strength, their ability to unite crowns through marriage, now exposed the continent's fault lines. Rival powers circled the carcass of a fallen empire, each seeking to claim what centuries of inbreeding had erased: legitimacy. The War of the Spanish Succession redrew Europe's map in blood and treaties. France, under Louis XIV, sought to seize control, while Austria fought to preserve its fading prestige. England, the Dutch Republic, and countless smaller states were pulled into the storm, their fates bound to a dynasty that could no longer defend its own borders. The outcome marked a turning point. Europe was no longer ruled by divine inheritance alone. It was reshaped by politics, economics, and the realization that bloodlines, no matter how noble, could rot from within. In the aftermath, the myth of divine monarchy began to erode. Scholars and philosophers started questioning the logic of hereditary rule. If centuries of pure lineage could end in madness, deformity, and collapse, what did that say about the supposed sanctity of royal blood? The Enlightenment, born in these very decades, found its fuel in the wreckage of Habsburg power. Human reason, not family descent, became the new measure of authority. Meanwhile, Austria adapted to survive. The remaining Habsburg branch rebranded itself as a stabilizing force, patrons of culture, guardians of Catholic faith, and diplomats in an age of upheaval. But the scars of the past never faded. Every new marriage, every royal birth carried the weight of medical scrutiny. The empire's rulers understood that the cost of isolation had been far greater than any battlefield defeat. Quietly, they began to marry outside their narrow circle, acknowledging what their ancestors had refused to see. Diversity was survival. Beyond the courts, Europe itself was transforming. The rise of nation-states weakened the old dynastic order. Power shifted from royal chambers to parliaments, from lineage to ideology. The Habsburg legacy lingered, not as a model to follow, but as a warning carved into the annals of history. A reminder that control built on blood is control built on sand. By the 19th century, the once unstoppable empire had become a patchwork of restless provinces. The revolutions of 1848, the rise of nationalism, and the march of modernity all exposed the fragility of monarchies that clung to outdated ideals. The Habsburgs had once believed they were eternal. Instead, their decline became the prelude to a new Europe, one forged not by ancestry, but by ambition, reform, and the recognition that even the purest lineage cannot outlast the forces of change. Centuries after the Habsburg crown fell, their shadow still stretches across Europe's imagination. Tourists wander through palaces where gold has dulled to the color of dust, photographing ceilings once reserved for emperors. Yet behind every fresco and portrait lies a deeper draw, the sense that these walls remember what they were never meant to reveal. The dynasty that once shaped half the continent has become a mirror for humanity's obsession with power, privilege, and decay. Modern fascination began with the same impulse that once built their empire: curiosity about what lies behind closed doors. Historians dissect their archives. Geneticists trace their lineage. Filmmakers recreate their tragedies. Each discovery feels like peeling back another layer of myth. The Habsburgs no longer command armies or dictate laws, but their legacy commands attention. Their story unites beauty and horror, brilliance and frailty, proof that greatness and ruin can share the same blood. The allure also comes from the contrast between their elegance and their suffering. Portraits show jeweled crowns and embroidered robes, yet those faces carry hints of exhaustion. Beneath the ceremonial calm, viewers sense the quiet consequences of choices repeated for generations. The Habsburg jaw, once a symbol of dynasty, has become an emblem of human limitation, the cost of believing that destiny could be engineered. In the age of science, that deformity speaks louder than any royal decree. Popular culture has revived their image in endless ways. Documentaries linger on the tragedies of Charles II and Empress Elizabeth. Novels romanticize their downfall. Museums frame their possessions as relics of a lost world. Each retelling adds its own interpretation, some sympathetic, others sensational, yet all return to the same haunting question: how could a family that held so much control lose everything from within? The fascination is not just historical, it's psychological. Their story reveals how ambition distorts judgment, how privilege narrows perspective, until survival itself becomes impossible. In a modern world still drawn to dynasties, the Habsburgs function as both caution and curiosity. Their archives remind scientists how fragile heredity can be, while their politics warn leaders about the dangers of insularity. Even the fascination with royal gossip, from palaces to tabloids, owes something to the template they created, the spectacle of grandeur masking dysfunction. The family that once ruled by bloodline has become an enduring lesson in the limits of legacy. Today, their portraits hang behind glass, but the fascination endures because the questions they raise remain unresolved. How much of our destiny is inherited? How far will people go to preserve power? The Habsburgs may have vanished from thrones, but their story survives as a living echo, a reminder that even in an age of progress, humanity is still drawn to the glittering edge between majesty and ruin. Behind the marble halls and gilded portraits, the Habsburg story was never just about crowns and conquests. It was about the silent price of power. Their obsession with keeping bloodlines pure had chained them to their own decay. What the world once saw as divine favor now reads like a warning written in bone and blood. The very traits they believed made them chosen, instead made them fragile, cursed not by witches or fate, but by their own design. Every secret affair, every whispered scandal, and every illness that haunted their dynasty carved cracks into the illusion of eternal power. Behind closed doors, superstition filled the void left by science, and the mighty Habsburgs prayed that faith could cleanse what blood could not. But history remembers more than just the crowns they wore. It remembers the cost. And as their empire began to crumble, so too did the myth of their divine right. The Habsburgs had ruled much of Europe, yet in the end, they couldn't rule themselves.